The bag hit the floor with a hollow thud, and Eva Bancroft did not look up. She folded the last of her cotton blouses with the kind of careful precision that only comes when a person is holding themselves together by threads so fine they dare not breathe too hard. The morning light crawled through the dusty window of the small homestead bedroom, casting long amber fingers across the floorboards, and she used that light to count her movements. Fold, press, stack. Do not think. Fold, press, stack. Do not feel. She had been packing for 20 minutes before Abraham Ashford woke. She knew the exact moment he came fully awake because the old rope bed creaked twice, and then there was silence, and that silence was more devastating than any shouting match they had ever endured. She could feel his eyes on her back like a branding iron held close enough to burn without quite touching. She had spent 3 days making this decision, 3 days of swallowing the truth she had uncovered. 3 days of looking at the man she had grown to love with every complicated, terrifying, bone-deep fiber of her being, and knowing that if she stayed, she was choosing to be the kind of woman she had promised herself she would never become. A woman who ignored the dark past. A woman who pretended secrets did not exist simply because the arms that held them were warm. The hidden motive she had discovered in that letter had changed everything. The letter she had found tucked inside the lining of his saddlebag, written in a hand she did not recognize, containing information that had made the floor tilt beneath her feet when she read it. A letter that suggested Abraham Ashford had not come to Ridgeline Creek, Colorado by accident. A letter that suggested Eva Bancroft herself had been, in some terrible fashion, a trap. She pressed her lips together and buckled the first strap of the leather bag. Eva. His voice was rough with sleep, low and careful, the way he spoke when he was trying not to spook her. She had noticed very early on that Abraham Ashford treated her the way a good horseman treats a skittish mare, with infinite patience and slow, deliberate movement, and she had loved that about him once. She was not sure she loved anything about him right now. She did not answer. The bed creaked again as he sat up. "Eva, what are you doing?" she finally spoke, and her voice was steadier than she felt. I would have thought that was apparent. A long silence. She heard his feet find the floor, heard him stand. "Where are you going?" "Somewhere that is not here." She buckled the second strap. "I will be out of your way before the morning stage comes through." She heard him cross the room in 3 steps, and she braced herself for a hand on her shoulder, for a touch that would undo everything, because Abraham Ashford's hands had always been her undoing. But he stopped just short of her, and she heard his breathing change, caught the rough hitch in it, and she absolutely refused to turn around. "Please," he said, and his voice broke on the word in a way she had never heard it break before. Not when the drought nearly took the ranch, not when the fever had him bedridden for a week, not even that night she did not like to think about. "Please do not go." And Eva Bancroft stopped packing. She did not turn around. Not yet. She stood with her hands on the buckle of her bag and the whole of Colorado territory pressing down on her shoulders, and she said very quietly, "Give me one reason, Abraham. One reason that is the truth." And that was the moment everything that had been building for 6 months between them came to its final crisis, cracking open like the high plains sky before a storm. 6 months earlier, Eva Bancroft had arrived in Ridgeline Creek on the second Tuesday of April, 1882, with $23, a letter of reference from a reverend in Missouri, and a set of practical expectations that left no room for romance. She was 26 years old. She had buried her father in the winter of 1880 and spent the following year watching her mother's grief hollow the woman out from the inside. And by the time her mother passed in the spring of 1881, Eva had understood with a cold and clarifying certainty that she was entirely alone in the world, and that sentiment was a luxury she could not afford. She had answered the advertisement in the Missouri Advocate not because she was romantic, but because she was sensible. The advertisement read, "Reputable rancher seeks capable woman for partnership and household management, Ridgeline Creek, Colorado Territory. Serious inquiries only. Apply to Abraham Ashford General Delivery." She had written a letter that was polite, formal, and entirely devoid of anything resembling flirtation. She had listed her skills. She could cook, she could keep accounts, she could ride, she could handle a small pistol with accuracy, and she was not afraid of hard work. She had not mentioned that she was pretty because she did not consider it relevant. She had not mentioned that she was lonely because she considered it irrelevant. Abraham Ashford had written back within 2 weeks. His letter was 3 paragraphs long and contained no poetic language whatsoever, which she had found profoundly reassuring. He described the ranch in honest terms, neither overselling it nor apologizing for it. He described the work in honest terms. He said he required a partner, not a servant, and that the arrangement could become a marriage if both parties found it agreeable after a period of acquaintance. She had packed her things, made the arrangements, and boarded the train west. The stage from the railroad at Pueblo had deposited her at the edge of Ridgeline Creek on a Tuesday afternoon that smelled of juniper and distant rain. The town was smaller than she had pictured, a main street with a general store, a livery stable, a land office, a saloon called the Copper Spur, a small church that needed paint, and a scattering of houses that held themselves apart from one another like strangers at a funeral. The mountains were visible to the west, white-capped even in April, and so enormous and immediate that she had stood in the road for a moment simply absorbing them. Abraham Ashford had been waiting by the stage depot. She had known him immediately, though she could not have said precisely why. Perhaps it was the way he stood, with a stillness that was not passive but watchful, the way a man stands when he has learned that patience is not weakness. He was 31 years old, tall, broad across the shoulders in the way of men who work with their bodies rather than with iron for decoration, with dark hair that needed cutting and brown eyes that were lighter than she had expected from his writing, a shade of amber that reminded her of creek water over flat stone. He was not wearing his best clothes. She had respected that. He took off his hat when she approached and said, "Miss Bancroft," not Miss Eva, which some men might have presumed, not just a nod. She said, "Mr. Ashford," and held out her hand, which surprised him slightly. She could see it in the flicker of his eyes, but he shook it without hesitation. She noticed his hands were calloused, and that his grip was neither crushing nor tentative. The drive out to the ranch had taken 40 minutes, and they had talked the whole way, which she had not expected. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers, which was more than she could say for half the men she had known. He told her things about the ranch, about Ridgeline Creek, about the history of the land with a quiet matter-of-fact pride that was not boastfulness. He told her he had been running the Ashford Ranch for 4 years since his father passed, that he had 20 head of cattle currently and was working to expand, that the previous housekeeper, an older widow named Mrs. Crane, had moved to Denver to be near her daughter in the fall, and that was when the arrangement had gotten out of hand and he had placed the advertisement. She had noticed in that drive that he did not mention a dark past. He did not mention secrets. He spoke about the present and the future with a straightforward clarity that she found both refreshing and, in retrospect, possibly too carefully constructed. The ranch house was small but solid, built of good timber and local stone. There were 2 bedrooms, a main room with a good fireplace, a kitchen that was better equipped than she had expected, and a covered porch that looked west toward the mountains. There was a barn, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden that had been neglected since Mrs. Crane left, and a bunkhouse that was currently empty because Abraham worked the ranch alone. She had unpacked her own bags that first evening while he made coffee, and the smell of it had drifted through the house, and she had felt, for the first time in a very long time, something that was not quite hope but was pointed in that direction. They had an arrangement for the first 2 weeks that was scrupulously correct. She cooked and managed the household and helped with the account books. He worked the cattle and maintained the property. They ate their meals together and talked about practical things. He did not make any inappropriate advances, and she did not encourage familiarity. On the 15th day, the arrangement shifted in a way that neither of them planned. It happened because of a thunderstorm. A storm came in off the mountains late on a Thursday afternoon, with the kind of speed that Colorado Territory storms specialized in, going from blue sky to black fury in less than an hour. Abraham was in the far east pasture when it hit, and Eva was in the barn trying to calm the horses when he came in soaked to the skin, leading his mare, and they stood in the barn together with the rain hammering the roof like 1,000 small fists, and the horses shifting and stamping, and the lightning turning everything briefly white. He had taken off his soaked jacket and was wringing it out, and she had handed him the rough towel she kept near the horse stalls, and he had taken it with a slightly startled look, as though he had forgotten there was someone to hand him things. "You should come inside," she said, "before you catch your death." "I need to check the east fence in the morning," he said. "That section has been loose since February." "You will not be checking anything if you get pneumonia," she said. He had looked at her then with the amber eyes that were lighter than she expected and said, "You sound like you mean that." "I generally mean what I say," she told him. "It saves a considerable amount of confusion." He had laughed. It was the first time she heard him laugh, a real laugh, not polite and not performed, and it changed his face in a way that did something unfortunate to her composure. They had run through the rain to the house together, and she had made him a second cup of coffee with a good amount of whiskey in it, and he had sat at the kitchen table and dried his hair with the towel and told her about the first storm he had weathered on this land, when he was 7 years old and his father had held him up to the window and shown him how lightning found the tallest point, and that the valley was safe because the mountains took the worst of it. "Were you frightened?" she asked. "Terrified," he said simply. "I did not let on. My father did not much tolerate what he called performances of weakness." "That sounds lonely," she said before she could stop herself. He had looked at his coffee cup for a moment and said, "It was. Yes." She had felt something shift in the room, something careful and significant, and they had both been very quiet for a moment and then talked about something else entirely, the state of the vegetable garden, she thought, and the price of seed corn, but the shift had happened and she knew it, and she suspected he knew it too. Over the following weeks, the arrangement continued to evolve by small increments that she tried to catalog in her mind, because she was a practical woman, and she liked to understand things. He began to linger over dinner rather than excusing himself efficiently. She began to tell him things from her past that she had not planned to share. He fixed the loose hinge on the kitchen door without being asked, which was such a small thing that she should not have noticed it at all, and yet she thought about it for 2 days. He rode into Ridgeline Creek once a week for supplies, and he began asking her to come along. At first she suspected it was practical, that she had a better eye for what was needed in the house, and she was sure that was part of it, but she noticed that he timed these trips on Saturday mornings, and that on Saturday afternoons in Ridgeline Creek there was sometimes music at the church hall, and that twice they had stopped to listen from the wagon, and she had caught him watching her face while the fiddle played. She was not a fool. She was, however, a woman who had learned not to want things too loudly in case they were taken away. May turned to June, and the mountains shed some of their snow, and the valley turned a shade of green so vivid it seemed improbable, and the cattle grew fat on the new grass, and Abraham began to talk about expanding the herd in terms that included both of them as a given, using "we" without appearing to notice he was doing it. And Eva had decided it was time to address the arrangement directly before she did something irreversible like fall completely in love with a man she had not yet made any formal agreement with. She had brought it up one evening on the porch. They sat in the 2 chairs that faced west, which they had begun doing as a habit when the day's work was finished, watching the sky go gold and then rose and then the particular violet that preceded dark, and she had said, "Abraham," he said, she said, "the advertisement said that the arrangement might become a marriage if both parties found it agreeable." A pause. He set down his coffee cup on the porch rail. "It did say that," he agreed. "I want you to know," she said, keeping her voice level with some effort, that I find the arrangement agreeable, in that specific sense. But I want to understand what you want clearly and honestly before we proceed in any direction, because I am not a woman who does things by halves, and I think you deserve to know that." He had been very quiet for long enough that she had begun to convince herself she had made a terrible error, and that she would need to pack her bags in the morning, which struck her with a fresh and piercing irony now, given everything. Then he had said, "Eva, I have been trying to find the right moment to say something similar for 3 weeks. I did not want to presume." She had turned to look at him then, and he was already looking at her, and the violet sky behind him made everything look like a painting that someone had made up to make a point. "Then say it now," she said. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because of the arrangement, because of you. Because you are the most clear-eyed, direct, capable, and genuinely interesting person I have met in 4 years of running this ranch alone. And I think about your opinion on things even when you are not in the room, and I have not done that since my mother was alive. I want you to stay because I think I am falling in love with you, and I know that may be too forward given the circumstances, but you just said you do things by halves, by which you mean you do not, and so I am trying to match that." She had looked at the violet sky for a moment because she needed somewhere to put her eyes. Then she said, "You also split that wrong. I said I am not a woman who does things by halves, which means the opposite of what you said." He said, "I know. I was nervous." She had laughed then, surprised out of her composure entirely, and he had smiled at her with the amber eyes warm in the evening light, and she had thought that this man was going to be her undoing in the best possible sense. "I am falling in love with you too," she told him, "which terrifies me completely." He reached across the small distance between their chairs and took her hand, which was such a simple and quiet gesture that it nearly broke her. "Me too," he said, "equally completely." The proposal came 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning after church, in the vegetable garden of all places, because he had caught her there at dawn pulling weeds, and had apparently decided that dawn in a vegetable garden was as good a moment as any, which she had found so entirely characteristic of him that she had said yes before he finished asking. They were married in the small church that needed paint on the 14th of July, 1882, with the Reverend Collins presiding and half the town in attendance, because a bachelor rancher getting married was a social event in Ridgeline Creek, and people showed up for social events. The school teacher, a sharp-eyed woman named Harriet Dove, who Eva had befriended in her first weeks in town, stood as her witness. The blacksmith, a large patient man named Thomas Webb, who had known Abraham since boyhood, stood as his. Eva wore a dress she had made herself from good blue cotton, because she had not had the money for silk, and had not wanted Abraham to spend money on silk when the ranch needed a new section of fence more than it needed a white dress. Abraham had told her privately that she was the best-looking thing he had ever seen, and she had told him privately that he was obviously suffering from sun exposure. They had been so happy. That was what made what came after so devastating. The summer of 1882 was, by most accounts, the finest summer Ridgeline Creek had seen in a decade. The rains came at the right intervals. The grass was good. Abraham expanded the herd to 32 head and took on a ranch hand, a young man of 20 named Daniel Rays, who was quiet and competent, and had a way with the horses that Abraham respected. Eva managed the household and the accounts, and began a correspondence with a woman in Denver about supplying the ranch with better equipment. And she rode with Abraham on the property lines twice a week, and learned everything about the land that she had not yet learned, which was considerable and fascinating. She was happy in a way that she had been careful not to name too loudly, because naming happiness sometimes seemed to call the attention of trouble. She learned things about Abraham piece by piece, the way you learn a landscape, finding new features each time you look. She learned that he read when he could find the time, and that his preferences ran to history and to books about natural science, and that he read sections aloud to her sometimes in the evenings if he found something particularly interesting, which she found endearing in a way she would not have predicted. She learned that he was a skilled woodworker, and that the table in the main room and both chairs on the porch and the bed frame in their bedroom were all things he had made himself in the long winters. She learned that he had a temper that was slow to rise and quick to resolve, that he never held grudges, and that when something troubled him, he went quiet in a particular way she had learned to read. She learned that he was deeply honest, and that this quality was so fundamental to him that small social deceptions of the kind most people employed without thinking seemed to cause him actual discomfort, which was why the letter had hit her like a physical blow. She had found it on the second Thursday of October. Abraham had ridden to the neighboring Caldwell Ranch that morning on business, something to do with water rights to a shared creek. He had taken his saddlebag and then come back for his good coat, and in the process the saddlebag had been left on the kitchen table, and it had fallen sideways while she was cleaning and she had caught it, and in catching it had felt the crinkle of paper from inside the lining, the inner lining, the stitched pocket that would not be obvious to anyone who did not know the bag. She would not have looked. She would have replaced it on the table and thought nothing of it, except that the lining had partially torn at the seam in the fall, and the paper had partially slipped out, and she had seen her own name on it. Not Abraham's name as recipient. Her name, Eva Bancroft. She had stood in the kitchen for a long moment with the bag in her hands. Then she had taken out the letter. It was dated the previous February, before she had even written her response to the advertisement. It was addressed to Abraham, and it was signed with the initials RC, which she did not immediately recognize. It was 2 pages long in a compact, cramped script that she had read 3 times to be certain she understood it. The letter said, in its first paragraph, that RC had located the woman Abraham was looking for, that she was living in St. Joseph, Missouri, and that she matched the description in all the ways that mattered. The second paragraph said that her circumstances were as had been described, alone, without resources, a practical nature, and that she was the kind of woman who would respond to an advertisement that was properly worded, which RC could arrange. The third paragraph discussed, in terms that made Eva's vision sharpen at the edges, a sum of money that had apparently already been partially paid by Abraham, with the remainder due upon her arrival and confirmed settlement at the ranch. There was one more paragraph. It said, "She doesn't know about the Dawson matter, which is the point. Keep it that way. If she finds out before the year is settled, you lose everything, and so does she." Eva had set the letter on the kitchen table and sat down in the chair and looked at it for a long time. The Dawson matter. She turned the name over in her mind. It meant nothing to her, but the rest of the letter meant something significant. It meant that she had not answered an advertisement. She had answered a trap. She had been located and identified and maneuvered into the position of responding, and the manner in which the advertisement had been worded, the particular combination of practical need and respectful tone, had been engineered to appeal to exactly the kind of woman she was. It meant that Abraham Ashford had known something about her before she arrived, something connected to a name she had never heard. It meant that her presence on this ranch was not the product of a mutual agreement freely entered, but of a hidden motive she could not yet identify. It meant that the man she had married 3 months ago and fallen in love with in the particular terrifying total way she had warned herself against had been operating from the beginning with a dark past and a secret purpose she had not been permitted to know. She folded the letter and put it inside her own apron pocket, and when Abraham came home that evening, she behaved perfectly normally, which cost her more than she had ever paid for anything. She needed to understand before she confronted him. She needed the full picture before she gave him the chance to explain it away, because she knew herself well enough to know that Abraham Ashford could very likely explain anything away if she let him try before she had all the facts, because she was in love with him, and love makes the mind look for exits. Over the following 3 days, she thought of almost nothing else. She went through everything she knew about Abraham's history in Colorado, everything he had told her, everything she had learned from Harriet Dove and Thomas Webb and Daniel Reyes, and the general accumulation of small-town knowledge. She thought about what the Dawson matter might mean and who R.C. might be. On the second day, she visited the land office in town on the pretense of checking property boundary records, which was not entirely a pretense because she had been meaning to do it for business reasons. But she also spent 20 minutes looking at the county records for adjacent properties and found something that snagged her attention. There had been a dispute over a section of land adjacent to the Ashford Ranch, a dispute that appeared in the records dated 1879, 3 years before Eva's arrival. The disputed section had been claimed by an Abraham Ashford and contested by a party named R.W. Caldwell, which was the neighboring ranch. The dispute had never been formally resolved in the records, which meant it was either settled privately or still pending, and either way it created an interesting picture. The Caldwells. R.C. could stand for many things, but in Ridgeline Creek, with a land dispute between Ashford and Caldwell in the background, R.C. had an obvious candidate. On the third day, Eva rode into town again and spoke to Harriet Dove at the school, which was closed for the lunch hour. Harriet was the kind of woman who knew the complete social history of every person in the county without making it seem like she was collecting information, and Eva had always appreciated that quality without quite knowing until now how useful it might become. She did not tell Harriet about the letter. She asked, in a roundabout way, about the history between the Ashford Ranch and the Caldwell property. Harriet's sharp eyes had moved briefly to the window and back. "That," she said carefully, "is a long story." "I have time," Eva said. Harriet poured her a cup of tea from the small pot she kept on the school's iron stove and sat across from her and told her what she knew. The Ashford land grant, as Harriet understood it, predated the Caldwell claim by almost a decade, going back to Abraham's father, James Ashford, who had homesteaded the valley in the early 1870s. The Caldwells had arrived later, bought adjacent land, and at some point in the late 1870s had gotten it into their heads that a particular section of eastern pasture, rich bottom land near the creek, fell within their purchase rather than the Ashford original claim. The records were genuinely ambiguous, which was not uncommon in the territory where surveys had been imprecise and land offices had been understaffed and overwhelmed. James Ashford had died in 1878. Abraham, 27 and newly alone with the ranch, had inherited a land dispute along with everything else. The Caldwells had, in Harriet's diplomatic phrasing, the resources to pursue the claim through legal channels and had been doing so intermittently. The disputed section was not enormous, but it was the section with the reliable water source, the creek branch, and without it the Ashford Ranch's value diminished considerably. "Is the dispute still active?" Eva asked. Harriet looked at her tea. "I believe there is a filing that comes up for territorial court review in the spring. In March, I think." Eva had ridden home with her mind working very fast. If the Caldwell dispute was the background to the letter, then R.C. was almost certainly Robert Caldwell, the patriarch of the neighboring ranch, who she had met exactly once at a church social in August, and found to be a large, florid man with a quality of jovial insincerity she had instinctively disliked. But that raised a question that made her stomach turn. Why would Robert Caldwell be writing to Abraham Ashford about locating Eva Bancroft? The letter's tone was not adversarial. It was collaborative. R.C. was not an enemy helping Abraham. R.C. was an ally. He had found her. He had arranged the advertisement. He had been paid for it. That meant the Dawson matter was something that connected Eva to the Caldwell land dispute in some way she could not yet see. It meant Abraham had needed a specific kind of woman with a specific background for a purpose connected to that dispute. It meant that whatever the Dawson matter was, Eva Bancroft was a piece in the game. She had loved him so completely. She arrived back at the ranch on that third evening and cooked dinner, and set the table, and Abraham had come in from the east pasture and washed his hands at the basin, and said something about the fence line in the way he did, and she had answered in the way she did, and they had eaten together, and she had watched his face across the table and thought, I do not know you. Or perhaps the more terrifying truth, I know you and you are not what I thought, and I do not know which of those things is worse. After dinner, she had gone to the bedroom and taken down the leather bag from the top of the wardrobe. She had packed in silence. And now, in the gray October morning, with the bag buckled and her hand still on the strap, she heard him say, please do not go, and she said, give me one reason that is the truth. The silence stretched between them like the territory itself, vast and weighted and full of things that could destroy a person. Then Abraham Ashford said, the Dawson matter. Eva turned around. He was standing in the middle of the bedroom in his shirt and trousers, his dark hair uncombed, and he looked like a man who had been walking toward a reckoning for months and had finally arrived at it and was neither relieved nor collapsed, just present. His amber eyes were steady on her face, and there was no deflection in them and no performance. You found the letter, he said. 3 days ago, she told him. I have been waiting to see if you would tell me yourself. Something moved through his expression. It was not quite pain and not quite shame, and it was more complex than either. Sit down, he said, please. I prefer to stand, she said. Tell me what the Dawson matter is, Abraham. Tell me why I was found and positioned and delivered here like a piece in someone's legal strategy. Tell me why Robert Caldwell arranged for you to place an advertisement that was designed to attract exactly the kind of woman I am, and tell me what my presence here is supposed to accomplish for your land dispute, and do it without making me feel any more like a fool than I already do. He sat down on the edge of the bed and put his face in his hands for a moment. Then he took his hands away and looked at her. Your father, he said, was Martin Bancroft. She stared at him. Yes. Martin Bancroft was a surveyor, Abraham said. He worked for the Territorial Land Office in Missouri, and then he contracted out to private parties in the early 1870s. In 1872, he conducted a survey of the Eastern Valley parcels in this county. He was hired by my father, James Ashford, to establish the boundary of the creek-adjacent land as part of the original homestead claim. His survey is the document my family's claim rests on. Eva was very still. That survey, Abraham continued, his voice careful and even but with something underneath it that cost him, was challenged when the Caldwells filed their counterclaim. Their legal argument is that the Bancroft survey was incorrectly recorded, that my father either pressured your father or paid your father to draw the boundaries in his favor. If they can establish that the original survey was fraudulent, then the land reverts to dispute and the territorial court has to redraw the boundary, and the most likely outcome is that I lose the creek access. And R.C., Eva said. Her voice was flat. Robert Caldwell. He approached me last winter. He told me that he had located the original surveyor's daughter. He said that if I could get you here, if you were on the property as my wife, that your presence would create a legal complication for the Caldwell's challenge, because your interest in the land's history would give me standing to bring a counter-challenge based on your father's professional reputation. He said your testimony about your father's character would be valuable. Eva said nothing. He offered to help me locate you and craft the advertisement in a way that would appeal to you, Abraham said. He had someone in Missouri who knew of your circumstances. He was willing to do it because he said he wanted to see the Caldwell claim shut down for other reasons, property line issues of his own. He is not a good man, Robert Caldwell. I knew that. I used his help anyway. You paid him, Eva said. Yes. You paid a man to find me and arrange for me to come here so that you could marry me for my usefulness in a land dispute. That was how it began, Abraham said, and his voice did not waver. Yes. The room was very quiet. Outside, a horse moved in the paddock. The October wind touched the window. And now, Eva said. Now I love you, Abraham said, which I know sounds convenient, which I know you have every reason not to believe, which I know does not cancel what I did or make it anything other than a betrayal of the worst kind, because you came here in good faith, and you entered into this marriage believing it was freely chosen when I had been maneuvering behind your life for months before you arrived." "My father," Eva said. Her voice was strange to her own ears. "Do you know whether the Caldwell accusation about his survey is true?" Abraham was quiet for a moment. "I do not know with certainty," he said. "My father was an honest man. I believed the survey was honest. But I also know my father needed that land and wanted to keep it. And I know that honest men under pressure sometimes do things that compromise their honesty. And I cannot tell you categorically that the survey was perfect because I was 7 years old when it was conducted, and I have seen the documents, but I am not a surveyor." Eva pressed her hand against the bedpost and looked at the floor. Her father, Martin Bancroft. A man she had loved with the totality a child loves a parent. A quiet, precise man with ink-stained fingers, and a level she had coveted as a child, because she liked the bubble in the center. A man who had come home from his surveys with stories about the land and drawings of topography that she had pored over on winter evenings. A man who had died in 1880 in Missouri, in the same town where he had spent the last years of his life, and had left her $23 and a letter of reference from a reverend and nothing else. Was it possible that the survey was fraudulent? Was it possible that her careful, precise, honest father had drawn a line in the wrong place for money or favor? She did not want to believe it. She also understood, with the hard, clear eyes she had developed since her parents died, that wanting to believe something was not the same as it being true. "Tell me the rest," she said. "The part about Robert Caldwell's real reason for helping you." Abraham looked at her steadily. "After I arrived at my arrangement with Caldwell, I began to have doubts about his motives. The help was too easy. The terms were too generous. He was not a generous man, and he had no reason to like me, so I started looking more carefully. And he has been purchasing land quietly," Abraham said. "Small parcels, distressed sales, from ranchers who have had trouble with water rights and legal disputes. There are 3 properties along the Eastern Valley that have changed hands in the last 2 years, all of them ranchers who were in the middle of land challenges. All of them sold below value." Eva looked at him. "He is manufacturing the disputes." "That is what I believe," Abraham said. "The challenge to my land claim may not be genuinely about where my father's boundary fell. It may be designed to put pressure on me until I sell. Caldwell has someone in the land office, I think, someone who can introduce delays and costs. If the challenge drags on long enough and costs enough in legal fees and in uncertainty, a man running a ranch alone is likely to give up and take what he can get." "And you thought bringing me here would give you a legal foothold against him," Eva said. "Initially," Abraham said. "But Eva, I want you to understand something. I want you to understand it not because it helps me, because I know it may not, but because it is true and you ask me for the truth." He stood up. He did not move toward her. "Within 2 weeks of your arrival, I had forgotten the legal strategy entirely, not suppressed it, forgotten it. It became irrelevant in the face of actually knowing you. I kept the letter in the bag because I did not know how to destroy evidence of what I had done, and I told myself I would find the right time to tell you everything, which is the coward's version of telling the truth, and I know that." Eva looked at him for a long time. "The year," she said. "The letter said if she finds out before the year is settled. You had until when?" "January," he said. "The court review is in March." The land office arrangement Caldwell described involved some kind of filing before the end of the calendar year. So I was bought and positioned, and you needed me cooperative and unknowing until January. "Yes," he said, "that was the original plan, which I abandoned the moment it mattered, which I know you cannot verify, and which may be exactly what a man who needs you cooperative until January would say." The honesty of that last sentence hit her like a second blow, harder than the first, because it was the kind of thing a manipulator would never say, and it was also the kind of thing a very clever manipulator would say knowing it sounded too honest to be calculated, and she could not untangle those 2 possibilities from where she was standing. She picked up the bag. "I need to think," she said. "Alone, without being in this house. Eva. I'm not leaving forever, she said, and she was not entirely certain that was true, but she said it because something in her could not bear the look on his face when he had said, "Please do not go," a look that had the quality of a man who has finally understood the full cost of what he has done and is braced to pay it. "I am going to Harriet's. I need one day. Do not come after me." He stepped back. "All right." She walked past him and out the front door with the bag over her shoulder, and she did not look back. She crossed the 2 miles to Ridgeline Creek on foot because it was a clear October morning, and she needed to move. And she needed the sky above her and the ground beneath her, and the particular reassurance that the mountains provided simply by existing without ambiguity, which was more than she could say for anything else in her life at the moment. Harriet Dove opened her door before Eva could knock, which meant she had seen her coming up the road, and she looked at the bag and looked at Eva's face and said nothing except, "Come in." She made tea. Eva sat at the kitchen table and told her everything. Harriet was quiet through most of it. She asked 2 questions, both precise, both the kind of questions that clarified rather than complicated. When Eva finished, she sat with her own tea and looked at the window. "There are 3 things you need to sort out," Harriet said. "They are separate problems and you are currently treating them as one problem, which is why you cannot see any of them clearly." Eva looked at her. "The first is what Robert Caldwell is doing with those land purchases and whether what Abraham suspects is true. The second is your father's survey and whether it was accurate. The third is your marriage and whether you can trust Abraham." She paused. "The first 2 are factual questions. You can find answers to them. The third is a different kind of question." "What kind?" Eva said. "The kind that requires you to decide what kind of evidence would satisfy you," Harriet said. "Not what kind of proof exists, because proof in matters of the heart is always partial, but what you would need to see to believe." Eva was quiet. "He told me on his own," she said slowly. "He did not wait for me to confront him with the letter. I told him I had found it and he told me everything, including the parts that made him look worse, including the admission that I could not distinguish his honesty from a strategy." She stopped. "He knew the most damaging possible interpretation of his own honesty and he voiced it himself." "Yes," Harriet said. "That is not the behavior of a man who is still manipulating me," Eva said. "Probably not," Harriet said carefully, "but you are the one who has to live in that house." Eva set down her cup. "Tell me what you know about Robert Caldwell's land purchases." Harriet looked at her for a moment. "More than I told you before," she said. She told her the rest. A widow named Frances Pell, who had owned a small farm near the North Creek, had sold her property 8 months ago under circumstances that Harriet described as rushed and distressed. Harriet had spoken to Frances before she left for her daughter's home in Pueblo, and Frances had told her that she had been in a land dispute with a neighboring claimant for nearly a year, that the legal costs had been grinding her down, and that when Robert Caldwell offered to buy her out, she had taken it because she had no other choice. The neighboring claimant, Harriet noted, had dropped their challenge within a month of the sale, which meant Caldwell was financing the challenges and then stepping in to purchase the properties when they became distressed. "He has someone in the land office," Eva said. "The land agent is a man named Silas Pryor," Harriet said. "He has been in that position for 3 years. He came from the same county in Nebraska where Caldwell has family." Eva stood up. "I am going to the land office," she said. "It is Saturday afternoon," Harriet pointed out. "It will be closed." Eva sat back down. "Monday then," she said. "I need to go through the survey records myself, my father's original survey and everything filed since." She looked at Harriet. "I worked in the county recorder's office in Missouri for 2 years when I was 18. I can read land records." Harriet smiled slightly. "Abraham does not know that." "Abraham does not know everything about me," Eva said, "which is perhaps something we have in common." She stayed the night at Harriet's, and they talked late into the evening about things that were not the Ashford Ranch or Robert Caldwell, about Harriet's own history in the territory, about her 10 years teaching in a 1-room school, and what she thought about education, and what she thought about the future of the territory, and whether Colorado had been right to achieve statehood 6 years ago, which Eva found she had opinions about that she had never had occasion to express. And she slept in the spare bedroom with the unfamiliar ceiling above her and thought about Abraham's face when he had said, "Please do not go," and what it meant that she wanted so badly to go home. Sunday she stayed at Harriet's. She wrote a letter to the Territorial Land Office in Denver, requesting any records connected to the Bancroft Survey of 1872, County of Las Animas, parties James Ashford and Caldwell. She gave Harriet's address as the return. Monday morning, she went to the Ridgeline Creek Land Office when it opened at 8. Silas Pryor was behind the counter. He was a thin man of about 40 with the kind of eyes that assessed and recalculated without appearing to do so. He greeted her pleasantly and told her she was welcome to review any public records. She spent 3 hours at the records table. What she found was this. The original Bancroft Survey of 1872 was clear, precise, and in her professional assessment as someone who had spent 2 years handling similar documents, entirely consistent with a properly executed survey. Her father's notations were methodical, and his boundary marks referenced 3 fixed natural landmarks that would have been unmistakable. The Eastern Creek branch fell unambiguously within the James Ashford parcel. What she also found was this. In 1880, 2 years after James Ashford's death, and a year after the Caldwell challenge was first filed, a corrected survey note had been added to the record. It was filed by a party not identified in the public record, marked only as County Assessor Review, and it introduced a discrepancy between the original survey's landmark references that, if accepted, would move the eastern boundary approximately 40 feet and bring the creek branch inside the Caldwell line. The correction note was in Silas Pryor's handwriting. Eva sat very still at the records table for several minutes. She turned and looked at Silas Pryor behind his counter. He was occupied with paperwork and did not look up, or appeared not to. She copied, in her precise and careful hand, every relevant detail of every relevant document, folding the pages into her coat pocket. Then she thanked Silas Pryor pleasantly and walked out into the October morning. She stood on the main street of Ridgeline Creek with the mountains enormous to the west and thought about her father's careful hands on a surveying instrument in 1872, getting it right because he always got it right, and a man named Silas Pryor altering the record of it 8 years later for a man with enough money to make it worth his while. And she thought about a land dispute that was not really a land dispute, but a scheme to acquire property through manufactured legal pressure. And she thought about Abraham Ashford, who had been fighting this thing alone and had, in a moment of desperation or bad judgment or some combination of the two, made a terrible decision about how to find the help he needed. She walked to the livery stable and arranged for a horse. She rode out to the Ashford ranch. He was in the barn when she arrived. He came out when he heard the horse, and his face, when he saw her, did something complicated and contained, as though he were not permitting himself to show too much in case he was reading the situation wrong. She got down from the horse and handed the reins to Daniel Rays, who had appeared from the direction of the paddock with the good sense to take the horse and disappear without commentary. She looked at Abraham. "My father's survey was accurate," she said. "I spent this morning in the land office, and I can tell you with professional certainty, because I spent 2 years in the county recorder's office in Missouri, that the Bancroft Survey of 1872 was correctly executed and correctly recorded. The Eastern Creek branch is yours by the original homestead claim and has been yours since the beginning." He stood very still. "Silas Pryor altered the county record in 1880, she said. "He added a correction note that introduced a discrepancy that did not exist in the original documents. He did it in his own hand, which means either he is careless or he did not think anyone with the knowledge to identify it would ever look." "Eva," he said. Robert Caldwell is manufacturing land disputes to depress property values and buy distressed ranchers out. He has done it to at least 3 properties in the Eastern Valley, and yours is the next one. He used you to help him find me because your situation was useful to him, and because a specific element of your claim, the connection to a surveyor's daughter, gave him a way to make the challenge more complex and therefore more expensive. She stopped. He is not your ally, she said. He was never your ally. He was using the arrangement you made with him as a tool, the same way you thought you were using him. Abraham had gone very still and pale in the way of a man processing something large. My testimony about my father's character, he said slowly, would have been brought into the challenge and used to add another layer of complexity to the dispute, making your defense more difficult and more costly, Eva said. He wanted you in the legal system long enough and expensively enough that you would eventually give up or go broke. My presence here was never intended to help your case. It was intended to complicate it further. Abraham turned and put his hand on the barn door frame and looked at nothing for a moment. He played me entirely, he said. Yes, Eva said. You played me entirely and he played you. It cascades. He turned back to her. His amber eyes were direct, and she could see the particular quality in them of a man who is about to say something that costs him considerably. I deserve everything you said when you left, he said. I deserve to lose the ranch. I deserve to lose you, which is the loss that actually matters to me, and I want you to know that clearly. I made a decision in desperation and loneliness and fear for my land that was wrong from every direction. I brought you here under false pretenses, and I let you fall in love with me knowing that I had not been honest with you about the terms of everything, and the fact that I fell in love with you in the process and that the plan became irrelevant to me does not change the fact that it was the plan. I cannot make that clean. I cannot take it back. Eva looked at him for a long moment. No, she said, you cannot. But, he said very quietly. But I spent last night thinking about what I require from a man, she said. Not what I wish for, what I require. And what I require is honesty, even when it is late and even when it costs. And what I require is a man who, when he has made a terrible decision, does not compound it with deflection and excuse-making, but stands in it and names it accurately. And what I require is someone who, when I walk out the door in the morning, says, please do not go, not because he needs me for a land dispute, but because my absence would cost him something real. Abraham said nothing. He was watching her with an intensity that she felt in her bones. I am angry, she said. I am going to be angry for a while. I need you to understand that I intend to be honest about being angry rather than pretending it is resolved before it is resolved. Yes, he said. I need you to understand that we are going to address the Caldwell situation directly and legally, and that I intend to be a full partner in that process, not a piece in a strategy, but an actual partner with actual information and actual voice. Yes, he said again, absolutely. And I need you to never use me as a tool again, she said. Not for land, not for anything. If you need help, you ask me for it directly and we decide together. That is what a partnership means. Eva, he said, and his voice was rough with something she recognized as the specific emotion that had no clean name, gratitude and grief and relief all tangled together with the particular terror of having almost lost something you could not afford to lose. Yes, to all of it, yes. She took the copied documents from her coat pocket and held them out to him. We are going to need a lawyer, she said. A good one, not a local one. Someone from Denver or Pueblo, who does not owe Robert Caldwell anything. He took the documents and looked at them and then looked at her, and she had the profound and slightly annoying experience of loving someone and being angry at them simultaneously, which she suspected was going to be the texture of the next several months and which she was, she decided, willing to live inside. Come inside, he said. I will make coffee. She followed him into the house, and when she came through the kitchen door and smelled the familiar smell of the place, juniper smoke and good pine and the particular mineral quality of the Colorado air, and underneath it the smell of the house itself, the table he had built and the chair cushions she had made and the herbs drying above the window, She felt something that was both entirely ordinary and entirely important, which was simply that this was her home and she was glad to be in it. He made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table with the documents between them and talked for 2 hours about what to do next. And it was the most direct and equal conversation they had ever had, perhaps because there was nothing left to protect or conceal on either side. And Eva found that she was good at strategy when she had all the information she needed to work with. And she found that Abraham listened to her in a way that he had always listened, but that now had an additional quality of deep attention, of a man making sure he understood exactly what she was saying and did not presume. They agreed on several things. They would seek legal counsel in Pueblo, where Harriet had a connection to a lawyer named Marcus Hall who had worked on territorial land law, and who Harriet had described as incorruptible. They would compile everything Eva had copied from the land office into a formal record. They would write to the Territorial Land Office in Denver requesting the original survey documents, which the Denver office would hold as the primary copies, and which Pryor would not have been able to alter. They would document the other distressed property sales and attempt to contact Francis Pell and the other ranchers who had been affected. And they agreed, with a quietness that felt like ceremony, that what had broken between them was not destroyed, and that they were going to rebuild it with better materials. The weeks that followed were not simple. Eva's anger did not resolve quickly, and she had meant what she said about not pretending otherwise. There were evenings when she was cool and precise, and Abraham bore it without making her feel punished for having feelings, which she credited to him. There were also evenings when they talked late into the night about things that were not the Caldwell situation, just the ordinary conversation of two people who are genuinely interested in each other's minds, and those evenings were a reminder of why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. The lawyer, Marcus Hall, arrived from Pueblo in early November. He was a compact, energetic man of about 50 with close-cropped gray hair and a methodical quality that Eva found reassuring. He reviewed everything she had compiled and told them, with a directness she appreciated, that they had a strong case. The Pryor alteration was the linchpin. The Denver Land Office responded to Eva's inquiry in the third week of November with copies of the original survey documents, which confirmed exactly what she had found. The original Bancroft survey was clean and correct, and the creek-adjacent land was unambiguously within the Ashford parcel. The alteration in the county record was not merely incorrect, it was fraudulent, and Hall was confident that a territorial judge would see it as such. Hall also took on the broader investigation into Caldwell's property acquisition pattern, writing to the affected former property owners and collecting their accounts of the circumstances under which they had sold. Francis Pell, reached through her daughter in Pueblo, was willing to provide a formal statement. Two of the other former ranchers agreed as well. Robert Caldwell, when the formal challenge to the survey alteration was filed in December, responded with the bluster of a man who had not expected his opponents to be organized. His lawyer filed counterarguments that Hall dismissed as thin. Silas Pryor, when confronted with the evidence of the alteration in his own handwriting, produced a story about clerical error that no one with access to the documents believed. The territorial court review that had been scheduled for March 1883 became, instead of a hearing on Caldwell's challenge, a hearing on Caldwell's conduct. The fraudulent alteration, the pattern of manufactured disputes, the coordinated property acquisitions, all of it came before a territorial judge named Morrison, who was, as Hall had described him, rigidly devoted to the law and immune to the kind of social pressure that Caldwell was accustomed to applying. Abraham and Eva sat together in the courtroom in Pueblo on a cold morning in early March 1883. Eva had dressed carefully, not for vanity, but because presentation mattered in legal proceedings, and she understood that. She wore her best dress, a dark green wool that she had bought in October before everything fell apart and had worn only twice since, and her hair was up, and Abraham beside her in his good coat was the kind of man who looked dignified without effort, which she noticed because she was still noticing things about him all the time. He reached across and took her hand as they waited for the judge to enter, and she let him, and the warmth of his hand was familiar and solid. Judge Morrison ruled in their favor on the survey matter without reservation. The prior alteration was found fraudulent. The original Bancroft survey was confirmed as the controlling document. The Eastern Creek branch was formally adjudicated as part of the Ashford land parcel with no further ambiguity. On the broader Caldwell matter, Morrison referred the evidence of the manufactured disputes to the Territorial Attorney General's office for further investigation, noting in his ruling that the pattern described warranted serious examination. Silas Pryor resigned from the land office the following week. Robert Caldwell's legal and social position in Ridgeline Creek deteriorated considerably over the following months. He was not immediately arrested because the Attorney General's investigation moved at the pace. Such things move carefully and with the weight of institutional process. But the community understood what had been happening, and communities, even in the wide and frequently lawless territory, had their own forms of judgment. Thomas Webb, the blacksmith who had stood at Abraham's wedding, told him at the general store one Saturday in April that Caldwell had been offered a price for his ranch by a land company from back east and was expected to take it and leave the county before summer. Webb said this with the particular satisfaction of a man who has watched an injustice corrected, which is one of the more deeply satisfying human experiences. The land was Ashford land. It had always been Ashford land, and now everyone knew it. Spring came to the valley with its usual extravagance. Eva planted the vegetable garden in the last week of April, and Abraham helped her because he had a morning free and he wanted to. And they worked side by side in the good dirt with the mountains above them, and she thought about how different this moment was from the moment 6 months ago when she had stood in the same garden with a letter in her apron pocket, and the worst kind of loneliness, the loneliness of having discovered that love had been built on something hidden. That loneliness was gone. What remained was the love, which had proven itself by surviving the worst thing it could have been shown about its own foundation. The rebuilding had been slow, and it had required honesty from both of them in ways that were uncomfortable and necessary. She had told him things she had not told him before, about her father, and about her years alone after her parents died, and about the particular quality of her loneliness that had made her respond to an advertisement placed by a man she had never met in a territory she had never visited. He had told her things he had not told her before, about his father and the land, and the fear that had driven him to Caldwell's offer in the first place, the fear of losing the only inheritance he had, the only physical connection to his family's history. They were, she had decided, two people who had both been shaped by loss into a kind of practical guardedness that was necessary for survival but that made love difficult. And they had both, in their different ways, chosen each other anyway, and they were going to have to keep choosing each other on purpose rather than assuming the choice was made. She said this to him one evening on the porch in May, in a way that was more honest than comfortable, and he had looked at her with the amber eyes that she had long since accepted were one of the better things in her world and said, "I choose you on purpose every day. I want you to know that." She had taken his hand. "I choose you on purpose too," she told him, "even the parts that cost." Summer came and the ranch expanded again. Abraham added 4 more cattle to the herd and hired a second ranch hand, a man named George Littleton who was older, taciturn, and extraordinarily skilled with fence repair. The east pasture was fully theirs, and the reliable water access made the cattle fat and the finances easier than they had been in years. Harriet Dove came to dinner one Sunday in June and pronounced the vegetable garden the finest in the county, which Eva received with appropriate humility and private satisfaction. Harriet and Abraham had developed a friendship of their own, based primarily on the discovery that they both had opinions about the territorial school funding situation that were aligned and forcefully held, and their dinner table arguments about education and governance were some of Eva's favorite evenings. In August, Eva discovered that she was expecting their first child. She told Abraham on a Tuesday evening, simply and directly as was her habit, and his response was to be so still for a moment that she thought she had broken him, and then to take her face in both his calloused hands and look at her with an expression that contained everything he had ever felt for her arranged in no particular order, and say absolutely nothing for long enough that she said, "Abraham, say something." He said, "I am the most fortunate man in this valley." She said, "You are rather fortunate, yes." He said, "Are you well? Are you frightened?" She considered. "I am well," she said. "I am somewhat frightened. I have not done this before." "Neither have I," he said. "We will figure it out together." That was, she thought, essentially their marriage summed up. She wrote to her mother's old friend, a woman named Agnes Crawford in St. Joseph, who had known her since childhood and who was the closest thing to a maternal figure she had left, and Agnes wrote back with advice both practical and emotional, and told her she was proud of her, which made Eva sit quietly in the kitchen for several minutes doing nothing at all. The pregnancy was not easy in the middle months. She was tired in ways she had not anticipated, and she had to renegotiate the distribution of the ranch work, which required her to accept help in amounts that she found difficult, because she was constitutionally inclined toward managing things herself. Abraham was patient about this in the way he was patient about things, not condescending but present and willing, and Daniel Reyes quietly took on several tasks she had been managing without being asked, and without making her feel diminished by it. She continued to manage the accounts throughout, which she refused to give up because they were hers in the way that the survey work had been her father's, a form of precise and careful contribution that felt essential to her sense of place on this ranch. The baby was born on a cold morning in early March 1884, almost exactly a year after the court ruling that had settled the land. The doctor from Ridgeline Creek was present, a steady man named Aldrich, and Abraham held her hand through the whole of it and was more visibly frightened than she was, which she found oddly comforting. The baby was a boy. He was healthy and loud and had Abraham's dark hair from the first day, which Abraham was insufferably pleased about. They named him James, for Abraham's father, the original homesteader, the man who had hired Martin Bancroft to survey his land with such careful accuracy that the record of it had survived alteration and legal challenge and come back true. Eva held James on the first evening of his life and looked at his small face with the dark hair, and she thought about her father drawing his careful lines across a page in 1872, getting the boundaries right, and she thought about the ways in which things connect across time in ways no one can see when they are happening, and she felt something that she would have described as peace, had she been the kind of person who used that word, which she was not quite. Close enough. Spring came to the valley again, and James grew fat and curious and remarkably vocal, which Eva attributed to her side of the family and Abraham attributed to his, and the argument was ongoing and affectionate. He was crawling by June and pulling himself upright against the furniture by September, and Abraham spent an unreasonable amount of time sitting on the floor within catching distance, which was not an image Eva had ever constructed when she had read the advertisement in the Missouri Advocate, practical, capable woman for partnership and household management, and which she found she loved with a specificity that surprised her. The Caldwell property changed hands in the summer of 1883, as Thomas Webb had predicted, and the new owners were a family from Ohio who wanted to run sheep, which the valley's grass could accommodate, and who were neighborly in the uncomplicated way of people who had not come from anywhere with a history attached. Abraham introduced himself at their gate the second week after they arrived, and Eva brought them a pie, and they were good neighbors. In the fall of 1884, with James learning to walk with the determined unsteadiness of a person who has been waiting all their life to be upright, Eva received a response from the Attorney General's office in Denver regarding the Caldwell investigation. Robert Caldwell had entered a formal agreement with the territorial court, which in the language of the document meant he had made a deal, restitution to the affected property owners in amounts determined by the court, a prohibition on land acquisition in the territory for 10 years, and a financial penalty. It was not a criminal conviction, but it was a public and documented accounting, and Francis Pell and the other affected former property owners received compensation they had not expected. Eva read the letter at the kitchen table and set it down and drank her coffee. Justice in the territory moved slowly and arrived incomplete, as it moved everywhere and arrived everywhere, but it arrived. She had learned that from her father, she thought, from a man who measured things carefully and wrote down what was true, knowing that accurate records mattered even when no one was looking, and even when the record was left in a file in a county office for 12 years before anyone came to read it. Accuracy was its own form of integrity. The truth stayed true whether it was witnessed or not. She thought she would teach James that. She thought she would tell him about his grandfather Martin Bancroft and the survey of 1872, the careful lines and the fixed landmarks, and about how one honest piece of work done with precision could mean something across decades that the person doing the work could never have predicted. Autumn arrived in the valley with the color it always brought, the aspens going gold against the dark green of the pine on the mountain slopes, the sky that particular shade of deep blue that only appeared in October at altitude, the mornings cold and the afternoons warm, and the evenings on the porch wrapped in a blanket with coffee going cold in her hands, because she kept forgetting to drink it, because the sky above the mountains was doing something unreasonable. Abraham sat beside her in the chair he had made, James asleep inside in the cradle he had also made, and the ranch around them in the particular evening quiet that she had come to regard as one of the finest things in her daily life. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "I have been thinking about how to say it for a while," he said, "and I have decided the direct approach is the only one that works with you." "You are learning," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I want you to know that this, specifically this, sitting on this porch with you in October with the mountains going dark and James asleep inside, is the life I want. Not the ranch as a piece of property, not the land as something I won or defended, the life, with you specifically. I want you to know I understand the difference now." She looked at the mountains. "You have said things like that before," she said. "I have, but I want to keep saying them so there is no ambiguity." He paused. "You came here because you were practical and you needed a new circumstance and you answered an advertisement. I came to find you through the worst decision I have ever made, which I will carry the weight of. But you stayed and you fought for this land with skills I did not know you had, and you rebuilt what I broke, and you are raising our son in this house, and I want to tell you clearly and specifically that I choose you, on purpose, for the whole rest of this." Eva set down her cooling coffee and looked at her husband in the evening light, this specific man with his amber eyes and his calloused hands and his woodworker's patience, and his capacity for the particular honesty that costs. This man who had made a terrible decision and had not run from it when it caught up with him, who had stood in their bedroom on an October morning and said, "Please do not go with everything he had." "I know," she said. "I choose you too." He reached across the small space between the chairs and she took his hand, and the mountains went dark on the horizon in the way they did, the reliable, enormous way of things that were larger than any individual difficulty, and that would go on being mountains after every hardship and every love story played out in their shadow. She was happy. She was going to allow herself to say that, quietly and without apology. The following spring, when James was 15 months old and walking with increasing confidence and a remarkable tendency to head directly toward whatever was most hazardous, Eva found herself expecting again. This time she was less frightened and more organized about it, which she attributed to having survived the first time, and Abraham was less visibly terrified and more practically useful, which she attributed to the same. The second child was also a boy, born in November 1885, and they named him Martin. Eva had suggested it quietly one evening, and Abraham had said yes without hesitation, with the particular quality of a man who understood exactly why it mattered. Martin Bancroft, the surveyor who got it right, who left an accurate record in a county file, whose daughter had come west with $23 and a letter of reference, and had eventually sat in a territorial courtroom and watched the accuracy of his work confirmed by a judge who was rigidly devoted to the law. Martin Ashford arrived in the world with Eva's pale eyes and a set of lungs that suggested strong opinions about being new, and James regarded him with the measured suspicion of a toddler who has not yet decided whether a sibling is an asset or an inconvenience. The house was louder with two small children, and Eva had less time for the account books than she was accustomed to, and the vegetable garden was somewhat less tended in the summer of 1886 than it had been in previous years, but none of these things constituted a complaint. They were simply the texture of a life that was full. Harriet Dove became James's unofficial godmother, a role she had not been formally asked to play but had assumed with characteristic directness, presenting herself at the ranch on James's first birthday with a small wooden alphabet board she had made herself, and an air of having been always intended to be present. She was at Martin's birth. She was at the dinner table several Sundays a month. She was the person Eva called when she needed to think something through, and she was the person who told her, at a kitchen table, to separate her problems so she could see them clearly, and Eva had never forgotten that. The friendship between Eva and Harriet was the kind that develops between two women who respect each other's intelligence without fuss, who disagree regularly and with pleasure, and who understand that loyalty is a verb as much as a noun, something you practice rather than something you feel. Ridgeline Creek changed in the years following 1882 as the territory changed. The railroad spur came through in 1886, which changed the economics of the ranching dramatically and in generally positive ways for the Ashford operation, making it possible to move cattle to market more efficiently and bringing in materials and equipment that had previously required expensive long-distance freighting. The town grew. The church got its paint, finally, in the spring of 1887, which Eva noted with quiet satisfaction. The ranch grew too. By 1887, they had 60 head of cattle and 4 hands, and Abraham had built a larger barn and extended the house, adding a proper second bedroom for the boys and expanding the kitchen, which Eva had designed herself with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. And on an evening in June of 1887, sitting on the porch she had sat on every evening for 5 years, with the mountains lit gold by the late summer light, and James, who was 3 years old and possessed of an exhausting amount of personality, running in the yard below the porch steps, and Martin, who was 18 months old and recently walking, sitting between her and Abraham on the porch floor with a collection of wooden blocks that Abraham had made for him. Eva thought about the woman who had arrived in this valley with a leather bag and $23 and a set of practical expectations that left no room for romance. She thought about what that woman had believed about herself. That she was not the kind of person who needed things, that she was self-sufficient in ways that made dependence irrelevant, that love was a category of experience she could approach practically and manage carefully and not be undone by. She had been in so many ways entirely wrong about herself, and she was profoundly grateful for it. Abraham said from the chair beside her, "You are smiling at nothing again." "I am smiling at something," she said. "You are not it." "That is reassuring." "I am smiling at this," she said. "At all of this, generally." He looked out at James chasing a chicken across the yard with the whole-body commitment of a small child who has a clear goal and no strategy. He looked at Martin arranging his wooden blocks with focused intensity. He looked at the mountains. "Yes," he said. "Me too." She took his hand, and Martin looked up from his blocks and said something that was not quite a word yet, a sound that was nevertheless entirely directed at both of them with small proprietary certainty, as though he were confirming that they were his and he was satisfied with the arrangement. Eva laughed, the real kind, the kind that surprised her, and Abraham did too. And the Colorado evening went on doing its improbable things with the light above the mountains. And the ranch breathed around them in the way of a living thing that had been tended carefully and had grown accordingly. And the sky above the valley was the deep, impossible blue of altitude in late summer, the kind of blue that a person could spend a whole life in the territory and never entirely take for granted. She thought about her father's survey lines. She thought about the way accuracy, insisted upon in one moment, could change the shape of everything that followed. She thought about how the truth, once found, holds its ground. She was Eva Ashford now, though she kept Bancroft in her own private accounting of herself, a nod to the surveyor's daughter she had been and continued to be, the woman who could read a land record and find a fraudulent correction in cramped handwriting and know what it meant. She was a rancher's wife and a mother and a full partner in the business of this land, and she had long since accepted, entirely and completely in love with a man who had made a terrible mistake and told her the truth about it, and had spent every day since choosing her on purpose. The sun dropped behind the mountain line, and the evening star appeared above the western peaks, the first and brightest, and James came to the porch steps out of breath and pink-cheeked, and announced with great seriousness that the chicken had gotten away, and Abraham told him seriously that chickens were difficult and that he showed real determination. And James accepted this assessment with the gravity it deserved, and climbed the porch steps to examine his brother's block construction with the critical eye of an older sibling. Eva rested her head briefly against Abraham's shoulder, which was not a gesture she made frequently because she was not a woman who made gestures frequently, which meant that when she did they meant more than they would if she made them all the time. He pressed his lips briefly to the top of her head. Martin knocked down his own block tower and looked at the result with apparent satisfaction. The evening settled into night, and the stars came out above the Colorado territory in the lavish, unreasonable way of stars at altitude. And the ranch was quiet, and the house would be warm when they went inside. And the accounts were in order and the land was theirs, and the record of it was clean and accurate, and settled in a courtroom in Pueblo in the spring of 1883, and everything that needed to be true was true. She had packed her bags in silence on an October morning, and he had said, "Please do not go," and she had stopped. She was still stopped. She intended to remain so.